Howdy everybody, this is Omar, your Audio Amigo, back with another Audio Amigo review for y'all. Simgot is a regularly featured brand on the sort of best IEMs for gaming lists that you see online from my friends and other reviewers. The EM6L, the EW200, and the Supermix 4 are generally pretty common sights on those lists, but Simgot has now gone ahead and decided to make a dedicated gaming IEM. This shiny fingerprint magnet is the Simgot EG280, a hybrid gaming IEM priced at $80 US. Simgot already has the EW300 in this price bracket, so how does the 280 differentiate itself? Will it take sales away from its metal sister, or is it something completely different altogether? Well, let's find out. As usual, quick disclaimer before we get started, the EG280 here was sent to me by Simgot for review. I'm not being paid for this review, but because I could turn around and sell this set if I wanted to, I've gone ahead and activated the paid promotion feature here on YouTube. I do these disclaimers because I believe in full transparency when there's potential bias besides my own personal taste at play. Thank you so much to Simgot for sending me this set, and thank you to all of you watching for your continued support. As you might be able to tell from the sort of shape of the box here, the unboxing experience here is classic Simgot with a few differences. You get the IEMs and the cable, which is pretty standard, but you also get a dongle DAC, which we will cover in a moment. This is essentially one of the big selling points of the EG280 here, and it's one of the big differentiators. Outside of that, everything else is classic Simgot. You get the same sort of leatherette case that you get on all the other Simgot IEMs, and you get the same sets of sort of black narrow bore and clear, slightly wider bore tips here. The crush resistance on the case is not excellent, but it's, not awful either. It is soft touch on the inside with the classic pouch for you to put dongles and things on the inside, so it's quite nice, and it's small enough to be decently pocketable. Simgot keeps reusing this accessories package. At this price point, I think it is a solid set of accessories. I would personally have liked to have seen a modular cable, especially if they're going to implement a USB C thing. Set of premium ear tips would have been a nice upgrade, but outside of that, this is about standard for this price range. One of the different things about the 280 is actually the cable. Gone is the sort of silver-black dual pattern cable that you see on most of these Simgot IEMs. In its place is a much more pedestrian, in my opinion, sort of budget IEM cable. It's the 4-wire twist with plastic sleeving. In my usage, it was a little bit more prone to tangling, and I've seen this sort of cable design on IEMs down in like the $30, $25 price point. This is a longer cable. This is 1.7 meters as opposed to the standard 1.4 meters that you get on other IEMs. You do feel that extra length if you're using this as like a walking IEM. Walked through some parks with this, and it was just, you felt the bottom of the cable sort of slapping against your shorts, which not ideal, but it also means you can roll away from your computer without having to worry about being caught by your own cable. The amp connector here is 3.5 millimeter only, has very subtle Simgot branding on it. Wish it was metal, but not super bad in all things considered. The Y split is very featureless, along with the chin slider, which works well with the sort of coating on the wires to hold its place well. It did pretty good on my walks. The ear hooks are classic Simgot. They don't really crinkle, and they're nice and comfortable. And the stereo indication is a little difficult to see, but as you can see, they've also put a colored dot there, which I really appreciate. Another thing that they've done is these are recessed sockets, so having a recessed connector actually makes some sense. Overall, compared to the cables that you see on the EW200 and the EW300, this, in my opinion, is just not as nice. It just doesn't feel as nice in the hands. It is a decent cable, and that extra length will be more at home at a desk than on a walk. I just wish that the cable overall was nicer. It just feels like it belongs, like I said, on a $30 IEM rather than on an $80 IEM. I was ad-libbing a little too close to the sun there, and I forgot to look in the script and see that there is an inline microphone connector cable here. This does work as play pause in my testing. The microphone quality sounds like this.
78 RPM records were the industry standard until they began their fade-out in 1948 with the introduction of Columbia's then-new LP format and RCA's introduction of the 45 RPM 7-inch disc in 1949. During the 1950s, singles were often pressed on both 45 RPM records and in the 10-inch 78 RPM format. Smaller 7-inch and 6-inch 78 RPM records were often produced for the children's market, i.e. kiddie records, as early as the 1930s, often with special colorful labels and some picture discs. Disney series singles from the 1950s, e.g. the DBR and LG records, had records in both formats.
And that's what the microphone sounds like. I think it's a good idea to have a microphone on a gaming IEM. It just saves you one purchase if you only want to buy one thing, so it makes sense they'd have an inline mic included here. Bit of a shame it's not a boom mic, but inline mic is better than no mic at all. Put that there. Compared to the EW200 and EW300, the build on the EG280 here is a bit of a departure from those other Simgot IEMs. Those are all metal. This is more of a resin metal sort of blend here. The lower shells, as you can see, are resin with resin nozzles and a classic mesh here at the end to protect the drivers from moisture and debris. Speaking of the drivers, you can see them right there. That's the dynamic, and that's the 6mm annular planar there. You can see the ventilation right on top of the annular planar. That works for the front volume for both of these. Rear volume is handled by this little pinhole right there on the side. Both of those holes meant no driver flex, no pressure buildup issues, no real problems here. Ventilation works fine. The faceplates here are mirror shiny and attract fingerprints like crazy, but there's no sort of acoustic features or anything on them, so no need to worry about those from an acoustic standpoint. As far as durability goes, the metal faceplate here does add some heft to the design, but overall, I see the main problem being this faceplate flying off. It's a common issue with IEMs of this design. I wish it was full metal like some of the other Simgot sets, but I think they went with plastic for lightness and sort of longer-term comfort. I get why they did it. The resin quality is nice. It feels pretty solid. These should last a good while, especially if you're going to be using them more at a desk rather than at the gym or on the go. Talking of the sort of weight, let's go ahead and pull up the spec sheet for the EG280. These are a two-driver hybrid IEM featuring what Simgot calls their second-generation 10mm SSPC crystalline LCP diaphragm driver. That is paired with the popular 6mm annular planar driver, which is typically only active above 8 kHz. Don't know exactly how it's wired here. All I know is that the EG280 does not change sound when you expose it to higher output impedance sources or impedance adapters. That's important for people who rely on onboard motherboard audio or older sound cards, meaning that the EG280 should not be a problem to just plug in directly. Then again, it's not a problem either because it comes with a dongle in the box. I mentioned the weight earlier. These are among the lightest Simgot IEMs that I've weighed, coming in at 5.9 grams a side, similar in weight to the Supermix 4 and the EW100P, which are the lightest ones in the family. The nozzles are right at 6mm in diameter, which is in line with the EW300 and the EM6L. Overall, while these might not be the full metal design that we're used to seeing from Simgot, the spec sheet is right in line with the rest of the Simgot family, and the driver configuration resembles the EW300 minus the PZT. But now it's time for the cool wall. Simgot's IEMs have essentially all been what I would describe as subtle or more elegant. The 100, 200, and 300 are all essentially the same shape with just different designs on the sort of faceplate of the shells. The 300 has the, sort of X heart design, which I think is the most interesting looking. The EG280 is an overall different shape. It's just a solid, polished metal, faceplate with a bit of a design etch for the Simgot gaming logo on that side, and the other side just says Simgot. While I like the fact that, the shells look different from each other, it's a subtle difference. I also like the fact that the shells are translucent, so you can see the drivers and the sound channels in there. Overall, though, these are pretty bland overall to me, so that's where these are going to end up. I'm going to put them in the bland section of the cool wall. I just wish they had a little bit something more going on. They use a red theme here. They could have put some red on the faceplates, I think, and brightened it up a little bit. Something kind of like the recessed design on the EW300 would also have been nice, but they were going for something stealthy, I guess. It just doesn't, do much for me personally. But that's just my opinion. We need to check in with the Council of Ladies and see what they have to say about the EG280. Are these pretty? Not really. Only lady number 2 thinks that these are pretty. The rest split the vote between meh and not pretty, so overall I'd say I'm on the money with the bland assessment. As far as if they cause comments or compliments, again, lady number 2 does think so. Maybe she likes chrome. Honestly, can't say. The rest of the ladies don't really think too much of these, honestly. Looking at their thoughts, it seems that the overall bland style of the EG280 doesn't do too well with the ladies. Lady number 2 does like the chrome and the smoked plastic look, but the other ladies see these as boring, generic-looking fingerprint magnets, so not this time Simgot, just not as good looking as some of your other IEMs. This being a self-proclaimed gaming IEM, I expected the comfort on the 280 to be one of the highlights here, and fortunately, I was not disappointed. The light shells, relatively narrow nozzles, the sort of small, mostly non-custom shape worked pretty well for me. There's a bit of a wing here and a bit of a valley, but there's really not a bulge here on the side. There's maybe a tiny one, but it doesn't feel as semi-custom as some of the other semi-custom shells. What that meant for me was basically hours of comfy wear with no issues whatsoever. My wife gave these a technical pass on the tiny ears test. She found the overall shape and size quite nice for her, but she did comment that these slid out when she first started using them. They didn't slide out all the way. It's just she would go for sort of a deeper fit, and then they slid out just a little bit, I think, due to this wing here. Seal didn't break. She was able to wear them with little to no issues, so while they weren't the most comfortable thing in the world, they did get a pass. I'd say well done, Simgot. If you were going for comfort as one of your main design goals, I think you did a pretty good job considering the positive score on the tiny ear test. But now it's time to talk about how the 280 here sounds. Before we get into that, we need to talk about the included little dongle here. This does have a built-in PEQ correction filter for the EG280. Let me go ahead and pull up the graph here. You can see that they're pretty similar, but the DSP version has some notable changes. The most noticeable one to me is it fills in the little valley from like 300 to 1 kilohertz. That combined with the ever so slight bass lift and the reduction in energy from 1 to 8 kilohertz gives the DSP tuning a sort of warmer, more mid-forward sound compared to the analog tuning here. Now, this is only the tip of the iceberg. Let me grab my Android phone here. Simgot has a new Simgot control app that they've developed, and if you plug in the EG280, you get access to a bunch of other EQ profiles. So your music presets, as you can see, balance, which is the one that I just showed you graphed. There's natural sound, hi-fi, pop, FPS, FPS2, MOBA, rhythm game. I think that's anime something and something. It's an acronym that they tend to use. And then ambient boost. And then on top of that, you also have your gaming EQ, which represents all of these games. So, you know, Counter-Strike 2, Delta Force, Valorant, PUBG, Rainbow Six, Arena Breakout Infinite, Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, Black Myth Wukong, Battlefields 1 and 5, Game for Peace, Genshin Impact. So there are a ton of baked-in EQ profiles here on the 280 on top of a full custom EQ that is a 8-band full PEQ with custom values that you can store and write directly to the dongle here. This is a pretty nice sort of PEQ implementation. The thing that I like is that you don't have to log in to use the PEQ implementation like you can with some of the other PEQ dongles. However, that's only if you use the Android app. Unfortunately, the iOS implementation is non-existent, which honestly is par for the course for all sort of EQ things on iOS. And the PC implementation requires you to ask Simgot for a link to the WalkPlay website, which does require you to log in. That does not have a guest mode like the Simgot app does. It's a huge bummer because not everyone is dual-wielding smartphone OSs. Not everyone has a burner email to use with WalkPlay. It's just a real bummer. The Simgot app, real quick, is honestly pretty nice. It works well. It doesn't glitch out anywhere near as much as the Moondrop app or the Tangzu app can sometimes have a couple of issues. I think it's pretty well thought out. The big bummer, as I'll mention later, is it doesn't work with any other Simgot IEMs. I tried the DSP versions of the 300, the 500, and the 200, and they just would not pair with the app. So as of right now, it's limited to the EG280. I have asked Simgot if they have plans to open it up. They haven't gotten back to me. I really hope they do because it would be a really powerful thing for existing EW300 DSP, 200 DSP, 500 DSP owners to sort of level up their sound in a pretty easy way with the built-in DSP on those chips. As far as the rest of my review goes, I will be reviewing the sound with the DSP profile enabled, as in my testing, it's the one that I preferred. It's the one that I thought sounded better. I will mention the analog sound throughout the segments here, and I'll make it very clear which tuning I'm talking about. So without further ado, let's get into it. We'll start off with the bass. The 280 here has a pretty nice bass boost going on with nice rumble and pretty good punchiness for a very dynamic sounding low-end presentation. Genesis has those rumbly, growly, low-end notes sitting beneath the sort of rest of the track. They have some great energy, and I feel like the 280 really does this track justice, no pun intended. That texture here is nice, and while I would have liked a bit more rumbliness in the low end, it does have a very tactile sub-bass response, and the mid-bass has a nice intensity to it. Bass guitars and kick drums are well represented here. Sultans of Swing and that present buzzy bass guitar sounds really nice. I don't feel like it loses out to the rest of the track, and while the guitar itself doesn't become overwhelming, it's forward enough that it has authority in the replay, which is all I really want, honestly. The bass presentation here, I think, is classic Simgot. It's boosted, but not to high heaven. It's competently done. Because the bass is boosted but not overcooked, there isn't a bunch of negative consequences sitting in the lower mids. There is enough warmth here that the tracks don't come across sounding papery or thin, but not so much warmth that things get thick or soupy. Even bass-heavy tracks like the Pump's If sounded pretty nice in terms of instruments and vocals. That track in particular has vocals that are pretty soft, and some extra husk or darkness to them really makes them sound a bit off. That isn't the case here on the 280, at least in my opinion. The replay on this track is quite nice, with the electronic backing instruments and strings sounding rather nice in the mix. Female vocals are slightly emphasized here, but not to the point where they sort of take the spotlight away from the instruments or anything. Fox's vocals in Clarity, for example. She rises above the electronic backing, including the bouncy, excitable bass, and while she doesn't absolutely dominate over the instruments, I feel like this forward but balanced tonality suits the track rather well. The fundamental frequencies aren't necessarily affected by the bass, I feel, nor is the female vocal presentation made harsher by the harmonics. There's maybe a hair of nasal tonality that does sneak into some of the higher-pitched female vocals, but the default DSP tuning helps by raising the mids up a little bit. It helps put the fundamentals in better focus, where instruments and vocals pop out just that little bit more compared to the analog tuning. As I said, it's forward but not unnatural, and the DSP tuning just fills in the mids nicely. It's one of the reasons I prefer it to the analog tuning. Like the bass, the upper mids and treble on the 280 here are really well controlled. While the upper mids can be quite energetic and they can add a bit of a nasal quality to some female vocals even with the DSP setting, I didn't find that the tonality ended up being shouty, bitey, or overly intense. Plastic Love, for example, the harmonics thrown off by her longer, drawn-out notes, the ones where she changes pitch quickly, they don't become bitey or annoying. They do add some nice depth and dynamism to the fundamental frequencies. If you typically find Simgot IEMs shouty, then I will say this probably will come across as shouty to you, but for me personally, I think these are quite nice. Speaking of nice, the treble here isn't really typical Simgot. It feels more like the EW300 with its gold nozzles, and that it's more subdued and toned down in the treble than exciting or energetic like the 500LM or even the EW200. Unlike the EW300, though, there isn't a PZT tweeter here. Now, personally, I didn't mind the PZT in the 300 all that much, but I know some folks just really didn't care for it. The 280 presents treble in a mostly similar way, but I find that some of the zing in the treble has been shifted up into the air frequencies. Van Halen's Jump, for example, the way the wash of the hi-hats is rendered is just different in terms of decay. The fading out of the note lasts a little longer, but the fading itself is less intense. It's not super unnatural feeling, but the 280 does have this little tinge of airiness that some people might not enjoy, and some people will actually really enjoy. Overall, I would say the treble is mostly controlled and subdued and shouldn't really pose a problem unless you're very shout sensitive or you're really treble sensitive in the sort of lower treble area. The technical performance here on the 280 is solid, but in contrast to some of the other IEMs in the Simgot lineup, I don't feel like it's anything groundbreaking. The dynamic driver does a fine job of resolving low-end details like the echo of the bass guitar in the beginning of Steely Dan's Black Cow, and it's not so bassy that the echo bleeds into the other ear, which it can do. It's a nice, balanced presentation that maintains the buzz of the strings and the echo like I tend to look for. As far as Waltz for Debbie goes, I think it did fine, but not amazingly. The background conversations were about where I expected them to be. They popped forward a little bit, as I expect to do on a slightly boosted set like this. But some of the glassware hits were a little less prominent than I expected. I would say overall, compared to some other Simgot sets, this is less of a technical powerhouse. I think that's done intentionally so as not to fatigue the listener over long periods of time. I don't think this is as technical as the 500LM. It's about on par with the EW300. That was not the most resolving set in the world, but it wasn't bad. And I think that's about what the EG280 achieves. Not bad, but not the most resolving set in the world. Stereo separation and perceived 3D soundstage is quite nice here on the 280. The guitar stylings of Al and Paco in Mediterranean Sundance are nice and separated in each ear. the audience fills in the center nicely, and neither guitar encroaches on the other in terms of sound, imaging, or sort of the overall sort of presentation of the track. The perceived 3D soundstage is also very strong on the 280. I Want You Back sounds very deep and also nice and wide. I was able to place the percussion separately from the guitars, and each vocalist sits in a slightly different place, which is nice for the imaging performance. Overall, I will say the replay had some nice perceived 3D soundstage, solid imaging. I think that the 280 here is maybe a little bit above the other IEMs at this price point in terms of imaging, 3D soundstage, and stereo separation. Nothing that will be groundbreaking or elevate flatly mastered tracks, but something that serves well mastered tracks well and will work pretty decently if that's the sort of thing you're looking for. So, without the DSP dongle, the EG280 here is a classic version of Simgot's H2019 Target. It is a well-executed V-shaped IEM with forward female vocals and a nice bass boost going on. The stock DSP tuning, however, mellows it out a little bit, turns down the upper mids and the treble, brings the mids forward a bit, and adds just a hint of bass over the top. In its analog form, I think this sounds sort of in between the EW300 and the EW200 if you're using the silver nozzles on the 300. In terms of overall sound balance and treble energy, less than the 200, but again, more than the 300. With the DSP dongle, though, this becomes a little bit more unique. It's more like the gold nozzled EW300, but with more forward vocals and less intense bass. It's an interesting tuning. I rounded up what I think is going to be its main competition at this price point. I just want to note that I use the DSP dongle for most of my comparisons. When I do talk about the analog tuning, it means I was listening to the analog tuning, so just keep that in mind as I go through the comparisons here. Why don't we start with another sort of DSP optional IEM that has been recommended to gamers and that also has a sort of similar half resin, half metal build, similar accessories package, and similar driver configuration. I am talking, of course, about the $75 Moondrop May. If you're using the DSP profiles on both of these, the sound is drastically different. The May is much more neutral, it's cleaner, it has more natural sounding female vocals, and a bit more sparkle with some of those instrument harmonics. In DSP trim, the 280 is bassier, rumblier, and has a bit more airiness in the upper treble. However, if you take DSP out of the equation and switch both of these into their analog forms, they become much, much more similar. The May becomes the rumblier, sort of deeper IEM, and it can match the 280 in terms of overall bass punchiness. The mids and the vocals are treated extremely similarly, and the treble is similar as well, with the 280 coming off that little bit brighter and airier overall. The May is the more relaxing IEM. I think the fit is better on the May as well, but this one comes only with the DSP connector. If you want to run the analog tuning on the May, you're going to have to either have an analog cable laying around, or you're going to have to invest in an analog cable to get that second sound. The 280, the dongle is separate, and you can easily switch back and forth between analog and DSP. However, this cable is not as nice as on the May. The May's cable is actually quite nice, and I think it's leagues better than the one on the 280 here. But the added versatility of just being able to unplug this is really nice. The other benefit of the 280 is that the PEQ app functionality on the Simgot app, as I mentioned, is leagues better than the Moondrop app, where the experience is much clunkier. Over here, you're limited to 5 bands of PEQ versus 8 on the Simgot. That does get solved if you get the specific gaming version of the May, which is the Ray. That's $100. And I don't like the idea that Moondrop locked a nice browser-based PEQ tool with much better functionality behind a colorway $25 upgrade paywall for what is essentially a May with, like I said, a green paint job. The 280 then has an easier to use PEQ implementation, and while it's not as nicely built or accessorized as nicely as the May, it is a better option if you plan on going heavy with the EQ tuning, or you want access to those game-specific tunings for less than they do on the cost of the Ray from Moondrop. How about some competition from within Simgot's walls? It's the EW300, priced at $76 US, but with the DSP version coming in at $90. This to me is a tale of adjusting your sound in an analog way versus adjusting your sound in a digital sort of DSP way. Both of these come with tuning variations, but they're achieved in different ways. In analog form, the 280 is essentially the EW300 with silver nozzles, but with a little bit more upper mids energy. The mid-treble energy, as I mentioned, shifts to the upper treble, since it's missing the PZT, and the planar can do everything there. They're very, very similar overall, A being these two. Throw in the DSP tuning. This becomes warmer and a bit more mids forward than the silver nozzles, but still not as warm as the gold nozzles on the EW300. As I mentioned, these two portray the treble differently from each other. They're both using the 6mm annular planar, so there is some energy in the upper treble, but I find that while the EW300 has that PZT, the 280 can be a little bit more energetic in the upper treble compared to the 300. The 300, by contrast, is more energetic in the mid treble. Like with the May, I can see people sort of choosing this if they're going to go hardcore on the PEQ tuning, whereas this, I think, is more for people who want to customize their sound using like foams, filters, nozzles, and that sort of thing. Other thing to keep in mind is if you dislike the PZT sound here on the 300, then this could be an option because it's missing here. But if it's the 6mm annular planar that you didn't like, it's still going to be here, and if you dislike that flavor, you're probably going to dislike this as well. Again, I think that which one you choose comes down to your use case. If you're going to be using the DSP version constantly, if you're going to be at your desk, the long cable is going to be important. The 280, I think, with the DSP implementation is just overall nicer. But if you prefer to customize a little bit more using foams and filters, you want the nicer built IEM, all metal shells, the EW300 is quite nice. As I mentioned earlier, the DSP version of the EW300 does not support the Simgot control app. I did try. So let's take a brief break from the Simgot on Simgot action for a bit and take a look at one of my personal favorite sets in this price range, the still great Tangzu Xuan Nv, priced at $80 US. In terms of overall tonality, these two don't really line up. But in terms of overall balance of sound, they're similar-ish. To me, the Xuan Nv comes across as a balanced, cleaner, more neutral, less exciting version of the EG280. The sub bass here is a bit more satisfying and rumbly, but otherwise the NV here is more controlled with its low-end presentation compared to the 280. Female vocals are interesting. The NV has much more forward fundamentals. The bass frequencies of the vocals sound more satisfying, but you get a little bit more shimmer, shine, and depth based on the harmonics here on the 280. Personally speaking, I prefer the vocals on the Xuan Nv. They're just a bit more balanced, but it's not to say that female vocals on the 280 are bad, it's just the balance is different. Some people will prefer it this way, some people will prefer it this way. The upper mids and treble on the Xuan Nv are in general more toned down and more relaxing, even with the DSP tuning here on the 280. This just comes across as the more neutral IEM. Technical performance, I honestly think, is pretty even here. The 280 might come across as more technical sounding, depending on where you hear details in your test tracks, but in my testing, I didn't think these two were all that different in terms of detail retrieval. If you want something that you can customize with PEQ and that has smaller, a bit more comfortable shells, the 280 will probably be the better choice here. If, however, you want a more neutral, more stylish option with a second DD rather than the planar here, then the NV, I think, is still a great choice. Finally, however, let's bring in what is still my favorite Simgot set under $200, the EM6L Phoenix, priced at $120 US. The EM6L was always a bit of an outlier in the Simgot family, and that kind of continues to be the case here. The Phoenix presents kinda sorta like the EW300 with the silver nozzles, but with a more balanced overall treble presentation and a cleaner but still warm mid-range. Compared to the 280, it's got more controlled, less intense bass, but the treble overall is more forward, more energetic. As I said, still controlled to the point where I don't really find the treble here on the Phoenix to be fatiguing at all. The 280 in its DSP form has a similar warmth and mid-forward nature to the sound, but it's notably more toned down and controlled in the treble as a whole. If you tried the EM6L and you found it just too fatiguing, or if you want to be able to turn it down with PEQ easier, the 280 could be a budget alternative with its dongle. However, in terms of overall sound, the EM6L is the more technical, the more resolving, and thus the more expensive option. You could grab the 280 and EQ it to the Phoenix, or any of these IEMs for that matter, but I don't like to mention that in sections like this because you can technically do that with any IEM, so it's not really something that I should really be mentioning, but I just thought, if you tried this, you didn't like it, or you returned it, you can try this one and EQ it to the different Simgot IEMs, I think, a bit easier than you could with any of the other Simgot IEMs. Wrapping things up then, in terms of overall tonality, the Xuan Nv here is probably the outlier. It's the much more neutral sounding IEM, and that combined with its relaxed treble make this the choice if you want a relaxing IEM on both ends of the scale that still has pretty natural tonality and a bit of warmth to it. If you like the analog tuning on the 280 and you want a more stylish looking IEM, the Moondrop May with its analog tuning is probably the closest IEM to the 280 analog in terms of pure sound here on the table. But to get that analog tuning, you are going to need to have a second cable lying around or to go buy one, since this only comes with the DSP option. Then you have the two Simgot sets here. In its analog form, the 280, as I mentioned, sits between the 300 with the silver nozzles and the 200 in terms of overall treble energy. In its DSP form, it warms up and essentially becomes the second most relaxing set that Simgot makes in terms of overall treble energy. It's not as warm as the gold nozzle version of the EW300, but it is more forward with female vocals, and the more toned down bass means that this can come across a bit cleaner sounding than this. Then you have the Phoenix, still a great departure from what has become the typical Simgot house sound, a bit more of a mid-centric tonality with shimmery but not fatiguing treble. There are some QC issues with the nozzles falling off, but gluing them back on is honestly not too much of an issue. As long as you do it properly, it won't mess with the sound. And while this is one of the oldest Simgot IEMs available, I still think there's some magic in this one that keeps me coming back to it. Alright then, I'm going to pull up the Audio Amigo Arbitrary Rating Scale and figure out where we're going to put the 280 here. It's an EW300 without the PZT. It's got a more comfortable, lightweight shell that does feel a bit cheaper, and I think it is a bit more comfortable over long periods because of the weight reduction and the change in material. If you're buying this for the analog tuning, you're basically going to get a slightly more energetic EW300 silver nozzle tuning, but without the PZT, which shifts some of the energy up into the high treble, so maybe it won't bother you. If, however, you didn't like the ring planar on the 300, this still has that, so this will probably still bother you. I think that a lot of the value for this set is in this PEQ dongle and the companion app that they provide. The Android app implementation is actually quite nice. It has a guest mode, so it doesn't require a login. And yeah, it might not work on iOS, but nothing really does. The bummer is that the fact that the web app is WalkPlay and requires a login, not the greatest thing in the world, but at least the option is there. The other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is this dongle is separate. You can buy this, take the dongle, and use it on any other IEMs that you own. That versatility is really nice, especially compared to something like the May, where the DSP is baked into the cable. I do think if you're going to do pure DSP tuning, this is a bit more usable than the May, just because the app is easier to use. And if you're using this for pure analog, honestly, like I said, it's a 300 without the PZT, so that's what you're getting here. While this doesn't outright beat the May or the 300 in terms of sort of value or sound, it doesn't outright lose to them either, and it does provide an alternative if you're a gamer, you want something with a cable and a removable DSP dongle. I'm therefore going to put this in the This Is Brilliant tier. I think it's a subdued, calm-sounding IEM that's very listenable. It doesn't really have any sonic issues for me, and while it straight up doesn't dominate the competition in any way, I think it does offer a nice alternative to the other things at this price range, depending on what sort of IEM experience you're going for. I could see you choosing this or either of these, or honestly any of these, depending on what specifically you're looking for. I don't think this falls short in any one big area. Time for my recommendation section then. This is not for you if you take your IEMs walking or running or to the gym. The long cable is going to more get in the way than anything else, and the more plastic shells just won't be as durable as something that's all metal. I would also say this is not for bass heads, and this is also not for treble heads. Both groups are going to want more energy on either end from the analog tuning, and the treble here is honestly pretty gentle depending on your track selection. You can always adjust that with the PEQ, but not everyone wants to do that. I also don't think this is really a upgrade or a must-buy if you already own the May or the EW300 and you enjoy their sound. This is not an upgrade in any sense of the word. The differences are mostly down to daily usability and use case rather than overall sound quality. I do think, however, that this can be a nice alternative for people who are looking at the Ray from Moondrop, because you get a DSP solution that isn't built into the cable and isn't locked behind a $25 upgrade or involves using the not very well optimized Moondrop app. I also think these work out. As I said, if you couldn't stand the PZT in the EW300, this offers a similar sound to that, but with a different treble presentation that might be more palatable to you personally. Alternatively, if you really hate messing with nozzles and mesh and you want a calmer tuning that you can access with an app, then I think that the dongle and the EG280 here provide a easier way to get into customizing your sound, provided you're using an Amazon or an Android device, if you don't want to mess with foams, nozzles, filters, and all that analog gubbins. If you're the type of person that does their tuning through PEQ, this just makes more sense than having to mess with the analog stuff. That's going to do it for the EG280. Let me know if you guys want me to graph all of the EQ settings that are on that app. I'm sure they'll be interesting to look at. I'm sorry I didn't graph them all or listen to them all. I am drowning in reviews as it is, and I'm a little bit under the weather. I don't know if you can tell my voice. I'm getting a little bit of a frog in my throat. So, coming up next is the KB-Ear KB03. It is the upgrade to the KB02 bone conduction IEM. Is it actually an upgrade? You're going to have to stay tuned for that one. But for now, as usual, thank you all so very much for watching. Huge shout out to the Compadres Club members. Remember, $5 a month, you get to decide what I review with your money, and you help make the channel more independent, less reliant on samples, tours, and so on. I really, really appreciate that. For all of you, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. This has been Omar with Audio Amigo Reviews, and I will catch y'all next time.